the idea that strain matters. We'll then talk about why we would use probiotics in cows and have a candid conversation about that. I want to introduce to you the topic of supporting normal and what that actually means, and then give you some illustrations as to whether or not you believe it's real. We'll then talk about Bovamine Dairy Plus, the best of both worlds, and give you some examples of the products that are available to you from Armor Animal Health. So when it comes to the idea of strain matters, everybody who supplies probiotics by law is required to include the genus and species of the organisms that are in our packaging. They could be Bacillus subtilis or Lactobacillus acidophilus or animalis, but in truth, it isn't genus and species that's most important. It's the strain of the organism that matters. Now, strain is an individual organism and all of its trillions and trillions of nearly identical clonal copies. So rather than throwing you under the bus with a bunch of Latin names for organisms, we'll talk about some species that are closer to home. So every human being on planet Earth is based on zoology, Homo sapiens. That's our genus and species. Every dog is Canis lupus. Every Holstein bull is Bos taurus. Those are the genus and species of some common organisms. So if I were to ask you, if you were picking an individual for a particular purpose, maybe a new hire in your organization, or a dog to guard property, or a bull for your genetics program, would knowing its genus and species be enough for you to make a selection? The person you're going to hire is Homo sapien, is that enough? Well, of course, the answer is no. So let me give you an illustration that drives this home a little further, and then we'll talk about some bacteria. So I mentioned a moment ago that all dogs on Earth are Canis lupus. In fact, all wolves on Earth are also Canis lupus. We include a subspecies, familiaris, for dogs because we do, by and large, control their breeding. And at the time this slide was made, there were 340 pure breeding populations of dogs known as breeds. And I'm going to ask you to just play along with me and let me relate breeds as if they were strains of bacteria. So your job is to pick the best Canis lupus, a dog, to defend your property against attacks from coyotes. One of your options could be a Canis lupus like this. This happens to be a Russian ovcharka, also known as a bear dog. This picture is not photoshopped in any way. It probably outweighs its owner by a good 80 to 90 pounds, and coming in at about 285, 290 pounds of dog. Or you could choose this dog to guard your property against attacks from coyotes. I think you would agree with me, the dog on the right would make a good appetizer for the coyotes as they came on your property. And I don't think anything is coming on your property if guarded by the dog on the left. Again, both Canis lupus, but perhaps the breed and the individual is more important. So now let's turn the story to strain matters for bacteria and just compare some things. So the three silhouettes that you're looking at happen to be three mammals, a man, a chimpanzee, and a mouse. And it should be no surprise to us that all mammals have many genes that are in common. In truth, we all have skin, hair, bones, teeth, intestinal organs, you name it. We're fairly similar in our functional components, but there are major differences among us between mice and men, certainly. But if you look at genetic diversity, there's only about a 10% difference in genetic diversity between mice and men. There's only about a 4% genetic diversity between humans and chimpanzees. And if I contrast that with strains of bacteria, for those genes that identify the genus and species of bacteria, for example here, Bacillus subtilis, there's about 99.9% genetic identity. That's how we identify species. But if you look at other functional genes, there can be on average 18% genetic diversity. That's nearly twice the amount of genetic diversity between two strains of Bacillus subtilis than there is between mice and men. And where they are divergent is extremely important. So these are data from 2007 from a microbiological standpoint, kind of ancient history, but it's still quite pertinent. At that time, looking at Bacillus subtilis organisms, there were 3,722 genes identified, of which 1,000 were divergent. And if you look at some important functions, for example, germination, the ability to hatch from a spore to a functional cell, there's 26 genes that control that function, and 42% of them have some divergence, some variation in the capacity of those organisms to germinate, or to produce antimicrobial peptides. 35 genes controlling that function, they're divergent 66%. So clearly there's an opportunity to select one strain versus another to have the greatest efficacy in the probiotic products that you're choosing. That's the takeaway message. For a particular purpose, whether it's a bull or a dog or a bacterial strain in a probiotic, strain matters more than genus and species. So now let's change the subject a bit with that background and talk about probiotics in dairy cows and have what I call a candid conversation. So when we ask, why do you use probiotics? And we ask nutritionists or dairy producers, these are the responses that we get back. When we ask nutritionists, particularly those nutritionists who love us or love the idea of probiotics, it's very typical for them to echo back our key marketing messages, that probiotics support normal gastrointestinal functions, the 4 digestion, absorption, barrier, and immune functions. They certainly can reduce the presence and potential impact of harmful organisms, and perhaps even they'll tell us reduce the impact of heat stress in dairy cattle. However, when I ask producers, I hardly ever hear any of those claims. What I do hear mostly is that we see fewer deads or fewer digestive upsets, or that their cattle are simply doing better. And if I'm honest and I look at these 6 statements and I was pressed, well, which of these 6 can I prove are actually happening on a commercial dairy? Well, I can tell you, I'm very hard pressed in a working dairy to prove that I'm supporting normal GI functions, or to prove that I'm reducing the presence and impact of harmful organisms or the impact of heat stress. I believe these things are true, and you can monitor that sometimes in a research trial, but in a working dairy, without having a contemporary comparison, it's really tough to prove that these things are happening. When I look at the producers' statements, it is possible that producers could make some observation that their cows are doing better. Maybe hard to prove, but I believe it's true. But certainly they can count fewer digestive upsets and fewer deads. And these are the things that stick in their mind. Now, I can't make claims that our probiotics keep animals from dying. I think the FDA might come back to me on that one, but it's nonetheless likely to be true because of all the things that probiotics are doing in the animals. So when we think about what is important as producers of probiotics, do we focus on the gains to be made by using probiotics, or do we tend to focus on the pains that producers are having? And in fact, are they mutually exclusive? Now, I will tell you an amusing anecdote. When I was searching Adobe stock photography to look for these kind of images, the crying farmer was a stock image. I actually had to add the money bag to the farmer because that wasn't a standard image. A farmer with money, I guess, is unusual. So I'm going to suggest that we tend to focus on relieving pains because producers are really mindful of the things that cause them stress. Digestive upsets, dead animals, displaced abomasum, retained placentas, etc., etc. So we're going to talk about stress for just a moment. And I was very happy, because I'm going to tell a bell curve story here in a minute, that the American Institute of Stress defines stress in an interesting way. It's a condition or feeling experience when a person perceives that demands exceed the personal and social resources the individual is able to mobilize. And if you look at this bell curve, it starts on the left with calm, and by and large, that's where I stay. There's the things that stress us in a positive way, so-called eustress. This could be getting married or getting a promotion or having a baby, winning money. These things are stressful, but in a positive way. And then there's those things that are distressful, that cause us to perceive demands that exceed our capacity. And I'm surprised that divorce is the number one, because in fact, marriage is the leading cause of divorce. And after you get divorced, I think punishment and injury and negative feelings ensue, but perhaps we're talking separate things. And of course, financial problems and work difficulties are also highly distressful. But bringing this a little closer to producers, there's a great survey from the Farm Bureau that asked the question, based on what you know, how much do you think each of the following impacts the mental health of farmers? And the strong majority picked three answers: financial issues, fear of losing the farm, or farmer business problems. All of those were above 87% as being identified as impactful on the mental health of producers. So let's look at that a little closer. I'm going to suggest to you that when it comes to what might be a relieving of pain and a gain for producers, the idea is that supporting normal is absolutely everything. I'm going to suggest to you that the greater the percentage of normal, healthy dairy cows in any commercial herd, the greater the likelihood of economic success, which is a gain, and the lower the chance of problems, which is a relieving of pain. Supporting normal is absolutely everything. Let's talk about what supporting normal means. We're defining normal here as generally free of observable abnormalities or deficiencies, functioning in a natural, expected way. That's what we mean by normal. And as promised, here come some bell curves. So on this graph, I'm going to draw some pictures for you. And I want you to be mindful that on the horizontal axis, we're talking about the probability of success. As individual animals move to the right, their likelihood of success goes up. As they move to the left, their likelihood of success goes down. And if I look at a large enough population of animals, I should get a bell curve distribution that looks something like this, where the percentage of herd is shown on the vertical axis. The box and whisker diagram at the top, in the middle of the box is the average for the population. The edges of the box are plus or minus 1 standard deviation. That encompasses about 68% of the population. And out the end of the whiskers represent the extremes at 3 standard deviations from the mean. That is a typical bell curve distribution. We're going to suggest to you that in any population, if I'm looking at measures of success, whether that's efficiency of milk production or percentage of the herd in any given week that has adverse health events, there is some point that is a threshold for disaster, a so-called tipping point, where individuals, when they go beyond that point, are at risk of failure. You may call them before they die, they may die, they're going to cause you some chronic problem. And regardless of what the problem is, individuals on the left side of that threshold are likely going to cost you more time and money than their relative value. We're going to suggest that if you're using an effective probiotic, that you shift the curve towards the right such that there is a greater percentage of normal animals in that population, and you significantly reduce the variation. If I go back, you see that the box and whiskers gets narrower and there's less variation in that population. And in this illustration, there's no animals to the left of the tipping point. Now let me go back to the normal situation and then throw real life on top of this, such as bad weather. And I want you to notice what happens to the curve. It flattens and gets broader, and the box and whisker diagram gets bigger. It's fewer normal animals and greater variation. And then I add bad feed, and then I add a disease challenge, and perhaps even poor management. And now in this illustration, up to 16% of the herd is at severe risk for failure because of these complicating factors on the variable of success. When I look back at the example on an effective probiotic, I can't stop any of those bad things from happening. And when they do, they're going to blunt the curve and push animals toward that threshold for disaster. What you're hoping is that every animal remains safe, even in the face of those challenges. So that's the idea of supporting normal. Now, let's talk about whether or not it's real, and let me give you some examples. So this first set of data comes to us from a farm, Union Go Dairy in Indiana. We've been observing this farm for 13 years. It's got 1,400 cows on average. And what you're looking at in these hundreds of dots is the weekly number or percentage of adverse health events beginning 13 years ago. The gray dots show the number or the weekly adverse health events prior to the use of an effective probiotic. And at that time, about 10% of the animals in early lactation were showing some adverse health event. They could have died, had been sold, have a retained placenta, a displaced abomasum, or some other non-metabolic illness. That's what made an adverse health event. They then, about 11 years ago, went on an effective probiotic. Again, you're looking at, and your eyes tell you that on average, they had fewer adverse health events. And the statistics tell us that dropped from 9.8 to 5.9. And then about 3 years ago, they went on our most effective probiotic, one we're going to talk about at length in a moment. And they went down to only 3.8%. So one way of looking at this is weekly adverse health events. Another way is to consider what percentage of animals in early lactation were simply normal. So the same data, simply illustrated for you a different way. So 11 years ago, and the prior 2 years before that, 13 years ago, about 90% of all the animals in early lactation were normal. That only occurred about 17% of the time. You had fewer than 85% of the animals that were normal. So 90% plus or minus 5% was the rule. So 17% fell outside of 85%. And in 1 in 20 weeks, only 80% of the early lactation animals were normal. They then went on an effective probiotic, and now 94% of the animals are normal in early lactation, and the variation went from 5% down to 2.8% per week. And then they went on our best probiotic, and 96.2% of the animals most weeks are normal, and the variation went down to 2.6% per week. Again, shifting towards positive with a reduction in variation. Let me give you an example now in some dairy calves. This was a challenge trial where we took Clostridium perfringens type A and challenged 30 calves. We had 3 treatment groups, 10 calves per group, a control group that received no probiotics, and then 2 groups that received our historic probiotic for dairy, and our best probiotic for dairy. All of these calves were individually housed. There was no nose-to-nose contact. We followed them daily from -7. We challenged them on day 0 with Clostridium perfringens, and we followed them for the next 2 weeks. We monitored general impression, appearance, diarrhea score, and survival. And I'm going to tell you that 8 of the 30 calves failed to survive. But the groups they were in is very interesting. In terms of general appearance, when all the measures, 0 was considered normal, anything above 0 was considered abnormal. So I'm simply showing you the percentage of normal observations across that period post-infection. Only about 45% of the time do we see a normal general impression in the control animals, as opposed to high 70s to low 80s in the probiotic treated group. For appearance, same thing, mid 40s to low 80s for the probiotic group. For diarrhea score, about the same, but the most impressive one is the survival challenge. Only 4 of the 10 control calves survived. 8 of the 10 bovamine dairy group survived, and all of the bovamine dairy plus group survived. Not only did the bovamine dairy plus group survive, but numerically they had the greatest percentage of normal scores for impression, appearance, and diarrhea. Again, a shift towards positive and a supporting of normal with our best probiotic. I could, if this was a different audience, speak to you about beef cattle or broiler chickens or young piglets or pig flows with 10,000 pigs or dogs, because we have examples of a shift towards positive and a reduction in variation across these species. But to drive this point home, I'm going to show you illustrations in the species that you're most familiar with. This is in Homo sapiens, and it speaks to the effect of probiotics in babies. This first study is a recent publication. It came out in 2021, looking at a bifidobacterium, BB12, one of the strains that comes from CHR Hansen. And it's a study on just under 200 babies looking at colic. When these babies were enrolled, on average, they cried for 140 minutes a day. If any of you in the audience are parents, you can imagine what that's like, a crying baby for 140 minutes, 2 hours and 20 minutes of crying on average, with a standard deviation of about 40 minutes, so a lot of crying. And over 3 weeks, those babies on an effective probiotic went down to just 60 minutes of crying, as opposed to 95 minutes for the control group. And this is double-blind, placebo-controlled. The parents nor the investigator providing the drops, these oil-based drops, did not know what they were giving the babies. And not only was the crying for the babies down, but they do a pediatric quality of life score for the parents, and they assess physical and emotional and social functioning. And lo and behold, when your baby is crying 80 minutes less a day, you actually do better physically, emotionally, and socially. And that was significantly different between those parents whose babies received an effective probiotic versus those parents who did not. One last illustration to drive the point home is a little more poignant, and this talks about the impact of probiotics in 2 studies on very early preterm infants that are at risk of developing a problem called necrotizing enterocolitis. This is basically an infection of the intestinal tract in these young infants, prenatal infants, preterm infants, I should say, that can result in severe pain and even death. So in the first study, 140 babies were looked at. In the probiotics group, only 6 infants showed signs of NEC or perished. In the control group, 17 babies showed signs of NEC or died. And if you want to talk about a meaningful shift in the bell curve, look at the center graph. The stages of the NEC are done by suspect, definite, or advanced, and you can see in the control group a distribution similar to a bell curve, but in the treated group, you see a shift towards the left and a reduction in severity. Quite significant for those babies. In a second study, looking at almost 1,100 babies, looking at those infants at Bell stage score of 2 or greater, which is definite or advanced, we cut the incidence of necrotizing enterocolitis in half in over 500 babies. If you don't believe in the power of good bacteria, then there are some moms I can give you the numbers for to call that brought a baby home from the hospital. They're believers. So, getting back to commercial dairies, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. Which of these isn't supported by an effective product or service from CHR Hansen? Peace of mind that you've done all you can do to keep your cows and heifers healthy and normal. That's the job of every producer, and we believe using effective probiotics helps you get that job done. Significantly reducing the number of times you suffer from rapid onset stress when an early in lactation cow dies. We have great evidence that you can reduce the incidence of adverse health events, including death loss, when cattle are on an effective probiotic. Making ends meet a little easier. The gentleman, Tony Goldstein, who owns the Union Go Dairy, gave us a testimonial at the World Dairy Expo saying that 10 years ago, he was on the brink of financial disaster and bankruptcy, made some changes, including using a probiotic, and now they're doing quite well. Managing an operation where the hospital pen is just empty space. We have an anecdotal tale, a producer coming to us and saying his neighbor stopped in and said, "Hey, aren't you keeping your sick animals in that pen by the end of your drive?" And the producer said, "Yes, I am, but I went on this probiotic and I don't have any animals to put there." It's an amazing tale. I wish we could replicate it everywhere. So when it comes to this stress and looking at what we can do with probiotics, perhaps we can impact not only the cattle in our care, but that pushes onto us and maybe reduces our work difficulties or financial problems or feeling that we are out of control, and perhaps we can shift that curve for everyone. And that's what we mean by supporting normal. Now, let me finish by speaking a bit about Bovamine Dairy Plus and why we call it the best of both worlds. So I'll start by simply talking about what it is as a product. It's a combination of 4 strains, Lactobacillus animalis, LA51, a Propionibacterium frundenricki, happens to be a subspecies Shermani, it's PF24, and then 2 species of Bacillus, a subtilis CH201, and a Licaniformis CH200. These are the 4 strains that go into Bovamine Dairy Plus. It was introduced in lactating cows in 2019. We actually started testing in 2018, and it's available for lactating cows, dry cows, and certainly calves. So what does it do? Well, if you ask, Bovamine Dairy Plus simply supports the normal functions of the gut: digestion, absorption, barrier, and immune functions. So when it supports digestion, it's because of enzymes being produced that allow more feed to be digested into nutrients available in the gut. For absorption, if there's more nutrients available and you have a healthier surface area for absorption and more of those nutrients move from the feed into the animal, then those animals have more resources to maintain themselves, to defend themselves, to grow, to produce a calf in the uterus, to produce milk in an udder. The barrier function relates to keeping things that are moving through the digestive tract from coming into the body proper. Now, this is very important because most of the harmful things that can get to us come in from the feed we take in. and of course, immune functions. Probiotic organisms do very good at tuning the immune system to generate a proper response. They interact with cells of the immune system that line the intestinal tract, and we've got great evidence of immunomodulation, starting with the production of cytokines and the interaction of dendritic cells and probiotic organisms. So if all of these things are working, then a greater percentage of your cow herd will simply be normal. And a day when every cow is normal is an absolutely great day. So, do we have evidence that this combination product should work? Well, we have over 700 research trials across the different segments of animals, including dairy and beef cattle. We've got over 100 published abstracts and dozens upon dozens of peer-reviewed journal articles. We wholeheartedly believe that these 4 strains are highly effective as probiotics. When they're consumed in an adequate quantity, they confer a health benefit to their host. And the combination came from the acquisition of nutrition physiology company that had the Bovamine dairy brand by CHR Hansen that enabled us to add our best probiotic bacilli. And that's the product that is Bovamine Dairy Plus. So when you think about why this combination is the best of both worlds, lactobacilli, if you look at what they are non-motile, they are colonizing symbiotic organisms. If you think about it, philosophically, lactobacilli want to be in a host. We keep them warm, well-fed, we carry them from place to place, and when we put them out of our bodies onto the ground, we do so in a rich food source. Remember, these organisms are non-motile. They come in through our mouths, they go out the other end. And when they're in the host, we have evidence that they can improve the barrier functions. They can help secure the tight junctions that keep the intestines from having a leaky condition. They can increase mucus production and be involved in competitive exclusion because they will bind to the epithelial cells of the mucus layer, preventing potentially harmful organisms from occupying those same spaces. And we know when they produce lactic acid and reduce the pH, it will have a deleterious effect on potentially harmful pathogenic organisms. When I contrast lactobacilli with bacilli, bacilli are motile hunter-killers. In truth, they came from the dirt. If you were to swab most horizontal surfaces, you would find bacilli. Philosophically, they don't care where they are. They are everywhere and anywhere. The richer the food supply, the better the conditions, the more likely they are to survive. And these organisms have been involved in active germ warfare for about 100 millennia. Those that we select are the winners of those battles. We know that when they're in the intestinal tract of the host, they can form biofilms by being very clever about signaling to one another. They can certainly produce incredibly high concentrations of digestive enzymes in the area of the intestines where they are, and they can directly attack and kill potentially harmful organisms, in particular those like Clostridia, E. coli, and Salmonella. They're very good at killing competitors in the same bio niche that's competing with their food sources. So I'm just going to show you some more data. This is Bovamine Dairy Plus, of course. I gave you the example of shifting the bell curve, even better than Bovamine Dairy. We talked about the calves, but let me give you one more large trial. This is done in 1,000 dairy calves. These were individually housed from day 0 to day 96. The heifers were Holstein and Jersey heifers. The steers were Holstein beef cross steers. There were 2 treatment groups. 480 of these animals were on Bovamine Dairy Plus, 532 were in the control group. They were fed Bovamine Dairy Plus. It was the calf and heifer product put into milk replacer for the first 60 days. We measured average daily gain, the treatment interaction, because these calves received treatments to keep them healthy and alive and well on average daily gain, and then also mortality. So looking at average daily gain as bell curve distribution, you can see in terms of percentage of heifers, a shift towards positive with a reduction in variation. The heifers on Bovamine Dairy Plus had a 1.4 average daily gain, plus or minus 0.21. The control group had a 1.28, plus or minus 0.26. A shift towards positive, a reduction in variation. The magnitude of the impact in steers was a little less, but you still see a shift towards positive and a reduction in variation. However, there was an interaction of the number of treatments that these calves received. So let me turn to those data. So you're looking at average daily gain on the vertical axis versus the number of treatments from 0 treatments to 9 treatments over the 96 days. And this is the population of heifers on Bovamine Dairy Plus. You can see the number of heifers and their average daily gain. It decreases with the number of treatments, as you would expect. At 0, there's a 1.48. That was the mean for the 0 group. That's the intercept. And then the slope was 0.031, basically negative as the number of treatments increased. When I compare that to the control group, you can see that the intercept was less, 1.41, and the slope of deterioration was greater at 0.5 versus 0.3. And if I simply count the number of heifers that were below an average daily gain of 1, there were 2 heifers that fell below that point in the Bovamine Dairy Plus group, while there were 20 heifers in the control group that fell below a 1.0 average daily gain. Looking at the same data for the steers, they averaged 1.64 in the 0 treatment group with the same kind of slope as in the heifers, a minus 0.3. And when I contrast that with the control group, they had a 1.56 intercept, less than in the treated group, and about the same slope, only slightly less for the impact of the probiotic. Looking at mortality, there was no significant difference overall. However, you can see that in the Bovamine Dairy Plus group, the losses were relatively early compared to the control group. And you can see this also in the curve. But overall, while I can see there may have been a slight increase in mortality, statistically, there was no difference. So again, offering evidence of the efficacy of Bovamine Dairy Plus. When it comes to the products that are available to you at Armor Animal Health, it comes in a variety of forms. We have the concentrated product that's a 500 head per day package or a 1,000 head per day package. They both contain Bovamine Dairy Plus and about 1,000 grams. We have a milk replacer supplement. You add this package to about 1.5 tons of milk, and you feed it about 3 pounds per head per day, or some variation of that based on weighing out the material. Or we have boluses that are actually Bovamine dairy boluses. These are an exquisitely nice product. They contain a 10x concentration of Bovamine dairy. And where we see them being used is when cows have an acute case of gastrointestinal distress, diarrhea, scouring, whatever you want to call it. A couple, 3 days of receiving a daily bolus tends to make that problem disappear. It's great to have on hand when you want to jumpstart the movement from a dysbiosis state back to eubiosis and returning that animal to a healthy gut. Boluses are a great tool. So the winner of our case of bovamine dairy boluses is Karen Jordan. Congratulations to Karen. And now I will stop talking at you and be happy to answer any and all of your questions. We may be able to unmute the mics, but you're welcome to type your questions into the chat room.
Yep, I will see if I can unmute the mics at this point. Otherwise, as Dr. Lerner said, go ahead and put them in the chat.
And if you're wondering, we are absolutely happy to make this presentation available to any and all of the participants. I can send a copy to Colleen, and you can just ask her, and she'll be happy to forward it to you. Or if you want to send me an email, I'd be happy to provide you with the presentation.
Yes, and we did record this presentation as well, so that we will send it to everyone who registered for the webinar so that you have a copy and can reference it later. And then feel free to forward it to your friends if you'd like to. Definitely recommend that as well. I believe I was able to unmute the mics for everyone. So if anyone has a question and wants to quickly ask it, go ahead. Or if not, type in the chat that I'm dead wrong and that you can only type it in the chat.
You know, that's the downside of virtual webinars. You can't see anybody's body language.
Right. Oh, we do have a question in the chat
Yes.
from Tom Hanneman. How can bovamine specifically improve performance on calves both prior to and post weaning?
So great question, Tom. We have data on pre-wean calves receiving bovamine dairy in milk replacer. We look at the development of the intestinal villi and ruminal papillae and have great evidence of improved rate of development towards normal function. And we also look at weight gain and find great evidence both pre-weaning and post-weaning. Very good question. And those data are available. Just contact your Christian Hansen rep and we can get those to you.
Oh, and he said, how early would you introduce pre-weaned?
So my personal belief is every animal every day should be on an effective probiotic. If you can get an effective probiotic into colostrum, I would include it then. Every day. You're simply trying to support normal and give the animals a capacity to resist the stressors in their lives, and stress begins day one in the life of a dairy calf. So every animal, every day would be our preference. If it works in preterm neonatal infants beginning on day one, I think it has a good chance of working in healthy dairy calves.
Okay, are there any other questions? Oh, we do have another one from Tom. He has lots of good questions today. What effect does this product have in possibly overcoming feed quality challenges?
Tommy, I do appreciate the good questions. When you think about what effective probiotics do, and now I'll look at the impact on the microbiome or the microbiota of the animal. We have good evidence that on effective probiotics that you are likely to see animals in a state of eubiosis, a normal, healthy, robust, stable microbiota. And we know that when they take in insults from feed or have environmental stressors, that their intestinal integrity, their gut health is going to be challenged. Heat stress is as real as rain. And we've all seen the impact of leaky gut, and Lance Baumgart will tell you it's 16 pounds of milk per day you lose when an animal is manifesting a response to heat stress. When it comes to feed challenges, Sometimes if the challenge is overwhelming, you're going to see the aftermath, whether it's acute SARA or some kind of scouring, something. But hopefully you're able to recover or prevent an acute problem because of the robustness that exists in the microbiota of the animal because of the support by effective probiotics. So you're simply looking at buffering capacity, if you will. And if the animal is buffered well enough, it will withstand those kind of challenges, unless, of course, they're highly severe or a very pathogenic organism or something. It isn't certainly a prevention of all ills, or there'd be no abnormal dairy cows, but we believe that a greater percentage of animals have a chance of remaining normal in the face of most of the typical challenges, including those that come in from feed quality. But you'll never overcome all of bad management, bad feed, bad weather, and other environmental challenges. It just, I'm not claiming that probiotics have that kind of capacity, or any additive for that matter, including therapeutic drugs.
Any other questions for Dr. Lerner? If not, any final thoughts as we close things out?
I appreciate your participation, and hopefully you'll find the recording in today's presentation useful.
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Colleen.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.